So now we're streaming. Hi, thanks for everyone who's punctual. We'll start properly in a minute or two as people receive their Eventbrite invites.
Yeah, and this is a conversation, so we're looking forward to seeing and hearing from you as well. Hi, Gustavo.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Hello, how are you?
No problem. Well, how are you?
I'm very good.
Where are you calling us from?
I'm calling from Argentina, Buenos Aires.
Nice. Is the heat wave over?
Give me 1 minute to find the right connection.
We still have a few more people joining, and we'll start in a minute.
Welcome, welcome. We're just going to wait for a few more people as they get their notice. Hi, Joshua. Thanks for joining. Where are you calling us from?
A small town near Seattle, Washington, in the west coast of the US.
Nice, so early morning for you. Relatively.
We're reaching about a half dozen participants, and we never really know what to expect in terms of turnout and participation. We're really thankful that you guys are here with us, and we're going to get started softly, as we'll probably see more people coming. And first, I want to introduce you to this, our second year of running Technology and Culture. We kickstarted this conversation at the very end of 2020, actually, but really got it off the ground during 2021 when we ran 4 or 5 different meetings around topics related to technology and culture. And Luma has done a wonderful job consolidating and documenting these conversations on the website, and on our website, in fact. So we recently published a piece on Envisioning.io, where we talk a little bit about the experience running these conversations, and of course announcing this one and a few of our upcoming topics. Our expectation this year is to run about a half dozen more sessions. We have a couple of topics anticipated, and we're open for suggestions to others. So today we'll be talking about individuality from the lens of technology and culture. And then in March and April, we'll talk about community and the notion of dimension. And again, open for suggestions for other topics that could be part of the conversation.
Yeah.
Luma.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle, and thank you everyone for joining us. As I said to a few of you before we started, we are looking at these conversations in a way where we want everyone to participate. So it'd be great to hear from you. We're going to be asking a lot more questions than giving answers. And today's theme is really focused on individuality. A lot of what came up in our conversations last year was around the limitations that we are facing from a societal level in engaging with technology and even developing technology, and how our societal constructs, capitalism, all these kind of influences that inspire behavior, let's say, shape how we use, but also how we benefit or even are challenged by technology. And individualism kept coming up as, you know, we're really focused as a civilization on providing individual achievement, that survival is based on how much you do as an individual. There are some community programs and developments that are developing, and we are going to be talking about those next month in our session. But we really wanted to focus this conversation on what are the limitations and challenges that we're facing from society, because there's this push towards individualism. My personal experience is that, you know, by constantly asking for kind of even career success to be something that is really just about, you know, me and my personal achievements and capacities, I struggle sometimes in finding the right partners and working with other people, and even socializing in kind of different spheres. How do you find that sense of belonging was also something we spoke about. The way technologies are developed are really, when we see with social media, we see a lot of this like promoting the self, and also an ulterior self than what we might be promoting in IRL life, right? So we'd love to just open the conversation to what is our sense of individualism, and how is it affected by technology, and how does it also affect technology?
We're throwing big questions out there. Do you guys feel that the question resonates? As in, is there correlation between individuality and what technology does to us? Do you feel that's something that are they at all related, or are they independent factors in your personal lives?
I mean, I can share something. I've been struggling to understand or like even define who an individual is. Is an individual like an isolated individual? Or are they like knowingly or unknowingly part of or implicated within systems, right? That shape and define how they behave. Which also, I guess, in turn shapes how they show up on technology, how they use technology, how they, I guess, also co-opt technology to live their life. I know these aren't like structured thoughts, but like, I guess this is leaving me with more questions than answers, which is how would we define an individual, like an isolated unit, or an intersubjective individual that even though they're not seeking it out, they're sort of implicated in systems.
Yeah.
I could add something. I'm not sure if the right topic right now in this conversation, but my point is the following. I'm not sure I am seeing the future in the right lens. I think we as a community, we are acting and doing and working with the lens of the past, not the lens of the future. So having all the changes that happened in the last week, year, month, I think a new capacity as a leaders for the next for this century is the future-minded leaders or person. So of course this will affect our interactions in social media, in the way we work, in the way we travel, in the way we relate with others. So I'm not sure if I have the right tool set. I'm not sure if I am prepared to live in the new world. That makes sense for you?
Yes, very much so.
When you say that we're using past techniques or ways of looking at the world, do you think that can change? I think Buckminster Fuller talked about we move into the future backwards by holding a rear view mirror, so you see sort of glimpses of it, but we're looking fully on the past. It's what we see.
Yeah.
Do you think we can work around that?
Using the past or my prior experience to predict the future, and I need to use the future to predict the future. You know what I mean? I think we are in an inflection point where this kind of conversation will become much more relevant. Different people with different experience, with different countries, in different time zones, and wherever, trying to figure out how the future will affect us by the traditional, the future, if the doing nothing future. My point is what we need to do now in order to go to that desired future.
Yeah, the desired future of not working, which I know came up a lot in our discussion on work, the anti-work movement. And of course, you know, a lot of this comes from the pressure of the individual, as you know, Pooja also asked, you know, what is even an individual, but the pressure of each one of us, and the I that you mentioned also, Gustavo, right? This attachment to an I, and how we exist in our communities, in our societies, and in the future, or how do we envision how we're going to exist in the future. And we're seeing so much conversation in the tech world around that, from the metaverse to, you know, what is possible from that. And I guess, you know, a lot of you decided to join us today. So it'd be great to just know what brought you here, what brought you to the conversation. What are you curious about when it comes to these ideas of, you know, our individual self and what it's going to mean in the future?
My answer is how to stay relevant. How to stay relevant.
How to stay relevant. Yeah, thanks, Gustavo, for sure. Joshua, you were about to say something?
I think the thing that's interesting, you know, the topic or the word in the topic that seemed really intriguing was how individuality is valued and formulated in different cultures. You know, I understand in my context how people think about individuality and how being exposed to so many people through different networks and through different tools who resemble you so closely, I think calls into question what individuality is for a lot of people. But I also know that in American culture, individuality is very important, or at least, you know, we give it a huge amount of lip service as being very important. And in other places that I've lived, not only is it sometimes not as important, it's almost seen as negative or as something strange, or as, you know, as something that's like antithetical to the idea of community. And I was very curious to hear what other people's perspectives on that are, because I think a lot of the tools that are being built and a lot of the ways that a lot of these systems are being built really privileges this idea that you should have this really strong sense of individuality, and you should not only be able to, but be encouraged to, or almost expected to express it all the time. And, you know, that's a particular view, but it's a fairly narrow one, particularly when we think about how communities and societies have structured themselves over time. This idea of individuality and it being something that you need to trumpet out to the world is quite new and very specific. And so I'm really curious what people's perspectives on how other views of individuality, and whether that's contrary to community, or whether that, how that melds into being a part of a community, exist now and may exist in the future.
And how do you feel about that, Joshua, about this pressure to constantly express our individuality and attach kind of some sort of individuality into our experience of these different tech tools? And
I am old enough that all of these things emerged in my adulthood. And so they seem both exciting and strange and slightly foreign to me. And I, have taught in graduate programs and at universities with people who are, in their late teens or early 20s now, and have grown up with this, and their entire adulthood and their entire conception of self was formed in networks that both encourage you to find very similar people and very like-minded people, but also kind of demand that you express a sense of individuality. And so to them, it doesn't seem foreign. It doesn't seem, it's not something that emerged in front of them. It's something that they emerged into as adults. And I think it's very interesting to realize, just how strange those things seem to me, and how non-strange they seem to people who are 15 or 20 years younger than me. And it really makes me wonder what will seem strange to, someone who's 20 today, what will seem strange to them about how their sense of individuality is formed, and how their sense of belonging to a community, and what it is about your individual self that gives you membership into a community. All of those things are constantly shifting in our communication technologies, and our the platforms on which we can express ourselves are incredibly important parts of those. And I don't know, it's just really intriguing to try to imagine what will seem strange to this person who, today is in their second year of college. What's going to seem very strange and foreign to them about conception of self and conception of membership.
I would correlate that with, go ahead, Luna.
No, go ahead, Michelle.
So building on what Joshua was saying, I would correlate sort of the historical aspect of individuality, which was often relegated to historical figures, right? In the past, in the distant past, there was no such thing as being remembered for anything unless you were a king or the scribe for the king. And today, of course, we're living the opposite of that, where everything is recorded, everything is registered, everything's on your permanent record, and you you're forced to build a caricature or a figure out of sort of how you select the things in your life that you want to broadcast and build around histories and that. But that's a lot of work, right? It's some, as you mentioned, some generations are just born into that. They don't see how to do it differently, and others, I guess, just want to be forgotten.
Yeah, and I was just going to say to that point that really what we empower and how we shape these cultures is what's going to determine what the future of that experience is going to be. As in the same way that today's experience are these social platforms that really emphasize individuality and everyone being important to a certain extent.
It's also interesting to think about expressing your individuality as a form of labor. You think of it as this, or it frequently is in, the cultures that I have access to, or it's seen as this expression of self. But if that's your job, or if that's a means by which you are, making money or building some resume that's going to bring you to money, that's labor. It's interesting to think of your selfhood and expressing your selfhood as a form of labor. And I wonder, that seems like something that is going to accelerate rather than decelerate or change. That, your branding of yourself and your constructing of yourself is very much your labor. And that's something to me that just seems like extremely strange. Even though I know that that's how celebrity cultures and a lot of things worked throughout the 20th century, like that wasn't something that normal people did. And now it's something that everyone does. And it feels really exhausting to even just think about.
Hi, it's Ina here. Sorry, probably should put the video on, but yeah, so I was thinking, and I think it's an awesome point. I'm just thinking if it's such a new concept really, because it's been for like ages that people create narratives and stories of who they are. They've just never been registered. You know, they were always like, you carry like called reputation or some sort of a narrative in the society or community that we care about. And we just don't, it was not registered in the social media as much. It was not public to that degree as it is now. But is it really such a new thing that we always care what people think of us and like how we represent ourselves outside and who we show we are, how we want to be perceived? Like, especially for like, I mean, I'm speaking of like from like thinking of women, how, you know, in the past it was such a big deal, like, you know, what kind of reputation you have. I'm like, not maybe even, I think it's even same now. So just more registered, more prominent, more into our kind of, you know, in everywhere on social media. But is it such a new thing, you think?
I think the challenge with answering that question is that history is something that is written, so it's the opinion of many, and we'll never really know how it evolved to where it is today, but we can suspect that a lot of the cultural practices, including you know, these technological experiences, have influenced human behavior to this degree where we're facing now. I mean, a lot of the conversation that we hear with the big five in their regulation talks, we'll call them, is that, you know, that wasn't their intention, but the intention has created these consequences. And what do we do about that now? And I think that's, you know, moving from the present moment to understand really like, how do we now, what is the right way forward? Maybe not the right, but what are the possible ways forward in light of understanding that we've created this culture that really emphasizes that everyone is important, which might be rightly so, but in a way that really can benefit not just the individual, but the collective sense of humanity, of human being. Maybe too big, but just putting it out there.
I would add that to Ina's point that I think the demand or the pressure or the requirement to be part of the narrative, I think is harder to ignore. So when I was a kid in school, of course, there was a social network going on, but it wasn't permanent, it wasn't registered. And like people outside of the school didn't know what was going on in theirs. I think we're always sort of building those social hierarchies and relations somewhat in public. But of course, the power of the technologies we're using now means everything is public by default, unless you make an effort to really close it down. And so I think I think it levels the playing field in a way that isn't necessarily healthy, in which you're comparing yourself to just about anyone else. It's how I would frame an answer to your provocation, I know. Yeah, how come we think everyone is important? Asks Jobin in the chat. Well, they're not, right? Or we're not. Not as in the big picture. And while we're here, we feel important.
Well, and culture has encouraged us to feel important, right? We are trained by our educational systems to become experts, and the more we succeed at that expertise, the more we succeed at life. And it's shifting, and there's a lot of kind of experimentation with what that needs to look like moving forward. But even, you know, our experience with the digital world is in creating our persona and optimizing it, so that maybe it's not necessarily about importance, but how to optimize the individual self is definitely a requirement of how we develop the future culture. And kind of bringing it back to what Joshua asked at the beginning, how do different cultures around the world grapple with these concepts? And from our experience of working in very different markets and being from different places as well, and working with different people on different teams from different places, unfortunately, this sense of individualism is really funneling to a global sphere, that you are only relevant if you participate. And if you participate in a specific way, which is one of the reasons we really started these conversations, because we noticed that all the conversations around technology are focused on one perspective or one experience. But it's just really hard to find nuance in terms of cultural experience around tech these days, and around individualism, because the aspirations are very very focused and more in that kind of digital world. I see that Joven also asked, what does it mean to optimize the self in the tech world? Well, it's twofold, right? It's using technology to optimize my experience of life, which I'm definitely partaking in, with different gadgets measuring different things and different experiences and tracking and following all of that, which is really emboldening, as well as like in kind of optimizing my persona online on my LinkedIn, how I frame myself, how I want people to receive me. There's so many kind of different facets of individualism in our tech experiences, in our experiences with technology these days, that it's really hard to escape. And I guess the question is this something that is useful for our communities, our cultures around the world? How do we envision a future with this kind of technology relationship with individuality?
I'm always challenged by the question of how much we actually can affect the future. As in, like, the job of the futurist is in part that of identifying what's going on, and to some degree shaping that. But the question easily becomes, is that even doable, or are these forces greater than any of us can individually change? So does the job of the futurist simply become observing and not shaping?
But are we not shaping by just existing somehow, maybe getting too esoteric? Like, by participating, by engaging, by making choices of what to use and what not to. I mean, we see a lot of these kind of controversies with different tech companies. In those choices, is that not doing?
I think we always are, right? We're choosing which platform to use, whether you want to install an open source email server on your own platform, or whether you want to purchase or use a free and open service. I mean, all of these are very concrete choices we're making that end up shaping which companies receive our attention, our resources. So in that effect, I feel we do. And there is a degree of individual agency over how the collective unfolds, because if everyone's using Google, then that's what the web will start optimizing for. Whereas if we diversify our tool use a little bit, then a different web or a different internet by extension will emerge. But then it always feels like either you're fragmenting the platforms, or deliberately going against the biggest player, which is an approach. Or you just give in and accept that the biggest player might just be the best. which isn't necessarily the case, at least not for search, for Google, for myself anymore. It's just an example of how companies easily become complacent, and they have sort of the wrath of the internet, or the collective attention of the internet trying to game their systems, which isn't ideal if you want to have objective search results. As a small sliver of technological example within search, but the same can be said about just about everything else. In automobiles, you don't have a single manufacturer, right, that owns 80% of the market. That's only in sort of highly technological industries.
Easily a breakout opportunity, but think about that. I'm just checking the time. Sorry.
Charlie inadvertently participated, I think. Jovan's asking if the big players start deciding for you without us even knowing. Yeah, I mean, there's bias in everything they make, right? If the big players, any big company, which is to say the culmination of many hundreds or thousands of people working together under a certain direction, designers, developers, managers, they're inevitably going to shape how we do things. Whether that's purposeful or not, I think is different. We saw examples a couple of years ago with Facebook identifying correlation between people's emotional state and the kind of news they saw on their feed as an experiment. And I'm thankful he did it. I know it's a big deal, the fact that they did it, but the fact that they did it and the fact that we actually have those results, and hopefully that it wasn't done again, is I think that's the takeaway. Especially because it rose such a furor around the conversation around the ethics of doing that most likely they stop doing it. But then whether TikTok does or not, that's a whole different question. Not to single them out or anything, just saying that there are many, many, many players that people spend a lot of time on. And the motives of the companies, we should never expect them to be noble, right? It's really about turning a profit for their shareholders, nothing else.
Yeah, and the irony of this individuality being something that you express uniquely, but somehow is getting transformed into this generalist kind of expression of an optimized experience of the self. So there's like a funnel of and that also applies in the responsibility of these companies who are maybe encouraging their employees in terms of diversity and inclusion, but also diversity and of thought, diversity of opinion, diversity of ideas, while everyone is just running so fast to succeed in one way. And that's where we lose so much of our, the nuances, the cultural kind of uniqueness that we can bring to the table. So a lot of it also has to do with speed, maybe. Speed and efficiency that is required from our communities with technology.
So Jovan's asking in the chat if we accept that companies are influencing users' behaviors towards certainty or optimized outcomes, can we then say that that's deliberate or is it or intentional? So I would go on in a branch and say that there's probably less intentionality than we want to attribute to these companies. As in it's convenient to think that there might be a top-down decision being made around our lack of agency and our so the way that our lives are unfolding, because then we can point at something or someone and say it's their fault. And I find that extremely unlikely, simply because the world is irreducible. Take the example. I mean, take the example of Corona. It's easy to attribute like, oh, such and such players had such and such intent, and they wanted this scenario to unfold. But it was entirely unpredictable how or to which degree that we've been stuck at home for 2 years, and of course, numerous other examples of movements and beliefs that have sprung up around that. It's convenient to think like, oh, someone was behind it and someone wanted this to happen, but how could they ever have anticipated this? So I would draw a parallel between the very big thing going on around COVID and sort of what these tech companies do. I think they're optimizing for very mundane things. Like they wanted to spend more time in app and click on more ad links, and anything that these dozens of thousands of people can do to make you do that, they will. That's the success of Facebook. They optimize everything to death, and it works. You do A/B testing all day long, and you're going to end up with that which is the stickiest. Is that a good thing? I think that's a more interesting question.
Yeah, it's also distracting. Like, I think we get so distracted by the conversation of accountability that we are not really addressing what the issues really are, where the challenges are, and how to solve for them. I think that's where we need to focus a lot of our attention, understanding, okay, part of the issue is that we do exist in a capitalist culture, in a capitalist world. So for any of these companies to continue, they need to make these types of decisions, whether we believe that they're ethically correct or not. And so it becomes more challenging, I think, when we think about a responsibility as individuals and what we can do as individuals in that realm of shaping the future, which again, every choice that we make contributes to shaping that future. And I don't have kids, but for people who have kids, I'm sure this is a really important topic, because we are seeing, as Joshua mentioned, this shift in relationship to individuality from generation to generation. So what does that look like in the future? What could that look like in the future? And how do we contribute to what that looks like in the future through our current engagements with technology, as well as the work maybe we're doing?
If you think about how, one thing that was interesting to me is thinking about what culture is in the context of in expressing individuality, or what does culture mean? And it seems as though culture provides you a set of tools or a set of options. And so even though I might not think of, I don't know, TikTok or Instagram or even my iPhone as culture, an anthropologist would say, of course, this is like a really fundamental, crucial part of what your culture is, the tools that you have access to, the ways in which someone recognizes something as being an expression of individuality, or being even what we recognize as a signal and what we recognize as noise is culturally determined. And so if you think in specific about individuality, then there are these like rituals of expressing that. And if you're interested in being proactive, or you're interested in providing tools for thinking about that differently, then there's I think there's a really interesting provocation that, like, if you want to move culture, you need to provide new rituals for that culture to express itself in. Because you can have values for a culture, but without some way to express it or enact it or perform it with multiple people, they're just abstract principles. They're not something that you can enact on a daily basis. I'm really intrigued by, a lot of the ways that people try to think of like open source technologies or more healthy expressions of community. Because when you put ritual on top of something, when you give it like a thing that you can do on a daily basis or an hourly basis or a monthly basis, some kind of time, some kind of action, some kind of like arena in which it's expressed, that becomes something that is cultural. It becomes something which is impactful. But minus those things, they're just abstractions that can't really be enacted on a daily basis. Maybe if I wanted to phrase that in the form of a question, like what is a new ritual that feels like a more healthy expression of individuality? Like what's something that seems like a thing someone could do with other people at some regular interval, or, in response to some event that feels healthy or feels, preferable.
May I just ask also, maybe it's a step back because I'm now confused why we think that what is going on now with expression of personality is somehow wrong. Why we actually think it's not a normal thing or it's just evolutionary step, why we think it's unhealthy, and just because it's too much. Just trying to understand, it's not okay, kind of, maybe it's just okay, like how it's going. Maybe it's just totally normal. It's just a new normal. It's just a different thing. We just dislike it because it seems to be uglier than it was before and like less community driven. But what is normal in that sense?
Yeah, I think that question is the prevalent question when we think about individualism. Is it important for our communities, for our cultures, to have this emphasis on individualism, and is it something that we should work towards empowering and emboldening? And what are the drawbacks? I mean, my gut is that it's never one way or the other. There's positive and negatives to any one concept or thought or perspective. And what we're facing is that while it is beautiful to have these kind of spaces in which we can truly express our natural self, it's also being manipulated in many other contexts, and kind of our less positive experiences of individualism are coming through much stronger than the more beautiful and like authentic and maybe that's also just my own personal opinion and my personal experience, because it's so different for each person. But I'd shared this article, I'm not sure if you're on the community, but about how NFTs have really taken over the blockchain right now, and that this sense of kind of developing your own icon or art representation online is becoming the new phenomenon. And I just personally can't wrap my head around understanding what is the use of this? Like, what does this offer us as individuals, as communities, and as cultures? And then there was another article that popped up this morning as well around, a lot of social influencers are making much more money than CEOs of huge, really powerful either organizations or companies. And what does that mean about our future as individuals and our communities and our cultures? All just questions. I really think this idea of ritual is also very important, because what we categorize or what we reference as ritual is completely changing, and we need to bring conscious effort to those connections. Rituals are really about things that we share with others. So maybe even sharing that sense of expression with others, and how we do that becomes a very important aspect of how we move forward. It's so tricky because there's so much that we can tackle when we get into these topics. And, Ina, I'm completely with you. I think there's been such a great development on allowing people also to step more into their authentic selves through technology, and to allow themselves to find community through technology, and feel that culture and that camaraderie in ways that they're maybe in real life cultures don't offer them, whatever that could be. And at the same time, we're seeing a lot of individualism that is not contributing positively. But how do we navigate it? How do we move through it?
Yeah, that's exactly also a question. I hear your point, and I kind of am in between, because I think that if there is an influencer, there is an audience. So it's not an isolation, and it's individualism with a given collective system that accepts that expression of individualism. Because all the following, I mean, might be like, I mean, I'm not huge into the kind of social media, but there must be really big pull and drive for people to follow somebody else's life. And that means maybe that's actually where we should kind of dig into and understand where actually what's going on and why is it become so interesting. Because there is a demand, then there is a supply, right? Because we know that the market is in need for this kind of like following somebody's like stories and life, you know, I don't know, whatever happening in the life of influencers. So I don't think it's an isolation. This individualism expression is not like isolated thing. It's just it's like an ecosystem of things that supports it. And I mean, we are not talking about the foreign land. We are all in it. We are all kind of included, and it's our behavior, right? So yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at it on the other side as well.
Jovin's saying that before we searched Google, and now Google searches us. And everyone's trying to chase in Google's footsteps and make their own prediction engines about our behavior. I would also add to, since I spoke up, I would add to Ina's point earlier about sort of which model of individuality we should strive for. I would totally agree that there's not a single one that is somehow true or right or correct, but rather we should be sort of deliberate about how we're deciding to spend our own time and energy around communities that are sustainable and fruitful, rather than trying to sort of optimize where like, no, everyone should follow this. Obviously, that's not what you suggested. I'm just agreeing that that's not the ideal outcome.
One culture is around values, right? Like a lot of culture is really focused on shared values and shared rituals and shared experiences. How is that shifting with technology? And we're seeing that with a lot of different movements kind of challenging our conceptions of even, let's say, national culture, yeah, like what we stand for in terms of the values of who we are as individuals. And I think that also is very interesting. What would, I mean, if we were to imagine what could the values of individualism uphold in the future, what could they be? What would be important as we move into an eminent future of a metaverse, whether you believe it, that that's where we're going or not? What are those values that individuals, I guess each community would retain its own, but what we're seeing is that it's not the case. It's really becoming a lot more funneled into one way of being, or a few ways of prominent being.
Perhaps the question is which communities are doing this right? Like who's getting it? Who's succeeding on this front?
What's also been really interesting is to see the push towards community as a response to the pandemic around the world, even in the tech spaces. Like everyone is now really thinking, okay, how do we connect? Because we were so focused on isolation and you know, quarantining and lockdowns, that people felt this desire, this kind of innate desire to connect with others. So there was this huge push towards cultivating community through tech, which of course we'll be discussing in our next session. I think Michelle put the link in the chat already, but it's a good way to kind of transition into that. Like we're experiencing this response to individuality almost as community, as kind of an emphasis. Okay, now I really want to spend some more time cultivating my community, and that will be my experience of culture. How does that resonate?
Well, I'll speak up. The other day, I was at a dinner with people who had never met, and we were sort of each introducing ourselves. And when the question came up, sort of which culture I personally relate to, I answered the internet, and there's something very spontaneous about the answer. So culturally, I grew up between Sweden, Portugal, and Brazil for family reasons, and but the internet was always sort of much greater than any of those individual countries or books or TV series or anything else for that matter. And then it's not even, to me, it's not even so much the individual communities that I hung out on IRC, at age 14 or whatever. There have been moments of communities that have sort of spoken to me, but the collective experience of growing up online feels like one of those things that shape possibly our sense of individuality as well. Oftentimes, when there's usually, like, everyone has their individual comfort levels about how exposed they want to be online, and I think it's very generational. It also seems to come and go, right? People with Finstas and wanting to go the opposite route as well and not be exposed. Personally, I've always felt very comfortable being exposed in a very privileged position, of course. Considering all of that, but always feeling very comfortable of sort of putting myself out there on the web and see what happens. And it's always, so far, it's only been beneficial and never to the detriment. Unlike others who have had horrible experience exposing themselves, their individual ideas and persons online. But I do feel that it's one of those things. If you grow up very close to the internet, possibly you become more comfortable. Or much more comfortable than others with that. Not that it's a universal, just sort of sharing my own individual experience in that space.
Well, and that it's becoming more and more the case because we are growing up on the internet, right? Like whether it's our generations or younger generations, soon every experience will be online, and that will have its own impact. Maybe not all experiences. Hopefully nature still exists in the future.
Photos of nature. Yeah, no.
For me, it's interesting that you raised that, Michelle, because while you were speaking, I was reflecting on, I was listening, but I was also reflecting on this experience that I had recently where I live in Holland, but I'm originally Palestinian and grew up in California. So a little bit of a global nomad. And I've been finding it really, really hard to find a sense of community in a new city, even though Amsterdam is quite diverse, after moving here during the pandemic. And I've been it's always been easy for me to meet people because I've had this global upbringing, and because I've spent so much time even online, as Michelle said, and connecting with others in different ways from what might be traditionally cultural. But I found that recently I had an experience of someone who was almost equally as culturally and nomadic as myself, and that felt really home. So it was the first time in my 41 years to actually be able to identify a sense of home in that experience of reflection of similar experience growing up. And as more and more our lives are, or our life experiences are going online, I think that's going to really shift how people perceive themselves as well as perceive others, and build ritual and build community. So it's quite interesting. No one has said anything about the metaverse. I've kind of plugged it in there a few times, but no thoughts or perceptions on it before we wrap up. Excited.
We could try throwing it out there as a theme as well. I mean, there's so much cultural development that will happen in those spaces, whether it's done on purpose or not. We could consider that as a theme for April, possibly.
Yeah. Or for May. Yeah. That's actually
for May. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if there's nothing further, thank you all for your insights. And yes, Pooja, please.
Hey, I'm curious how you came to this series, and if you could like give me a little bit of context, because maybe I'm missing. I'm just curious to see how these programs evolve and what made you choose these topics and such.
I mean, I think Luma and myself have naturally gravitated towards these themes, and we decided to turn it into something a bit more public. That would be my short answer.
Yeah, I was going to say the same. In the work, Michelle and I are both friends and colleagues, and have these conversations quite frequently. And in 2020, we realized it's something that would be great to include a wider audience and get more perspective. Sorry, I'm going to mute Lauren. I think she unmuted by accident. Yeah, so we've been having these conversations, and the topics come up almost randomly, kind of relevant to what we're thinking about, but also what the world is talking about and experiencing. So yeah.
Awesome. I'm curious to get a sense for what both of you have been reading, or basically, yeah, what have you been going to read up on these ideas, or yeah, any suggestions on information or sources or resources?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely joined the Envisioning community because there's so much being shared on the Slack. I don't know if you're a part of it already. We'll put the link for the community in the chat. I'll see if I can grab it. So yeah, you'll find a lot of reading sources and around these topics, and also so much more in that community Slack. So I definitely recommend that. Also, we are writing about each one of these conversations, so stay tuned for that. We'll send that out. Yeah, hopefully.
One book that comes to mind to have a concrete answer next to the open-ended one, I think a book that matches or mirrors some of what we've been discussing here today, though I haven't finished it, is The Disconnect by Roisin Kyberd. So she talks very eloquently about this feeling of growing up online, I want to say, as someone who's been exposed very differently than myself, but still under similar circumstances. It came to mind the moment you asked about a book. This came to mind, so I didn't want to miss the opportunity to share it.
Fantastic, thanks so much.
We'll be back in a month with more. We'll be sharing this conversation on YouTube, and we'll be consolidating some of the notes, ideas from the session as a post as well. We look forward to seeing you on the Slack and following our weekly newsletter, where we'll announce these sessions and a lot more. So thanks so much for your time and your attention today, and we'll see you guys soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.